The way a story begins determines how everything that follows is understood. When the foundation is even slightly off, even by the smallest degree, every layer built on top of it begins to lean in that same direction. Over time, that leaning doesn't feel like distortion anymore. It feels normal. It feels familiar. And because it feels familiar, most people never stop to question it. They inherit it, they live inside of it, and eventually they pass it on without ever realizing where it began to shift. As we look at Genesis, it's one of the most read and quoted texts in human history. Yet, very few people slow down enough to truly examine how it actually begins. Most people don't question the starting point. They receive an interpretation that's already been shaped through generations, already been filtered through language and tradition, and already framed in a way that feels settled. Then they build their entire understanding on top of that inherited frame. But when you return to the original Hebrew and look carefully, when you look patiently and honestly, the opening isn't saying exactly what most people have been taught to believe. And once you see it clearly, something begins to open, not just in the text, but in how you understand yourself and the story that you're living inside of. This is not the story of one man being created first. It's the story of humanity before it was ever experienced as an individual. In Genesis 1:26 to 28, the text introduces humanity using the word ha-adam. This word's often read as if it refers to a specific individual named Adam. But in the original context, that's not what it's doing. It's not functioning as a personal name, it's a collective term, pointing to humanity as a whole rather than a single isolated figure. The text says, "Let us make Ha-Adam in our image," and then immediately tells us that this is humanity being created, male and female. And that detail matters more than most people realize. It shows that what's being described here isn't a single male individual that exists before woman, but a unified human identity that already includes both from the very beginning. At this stage, the story isn't about separation. It isn't about order or roles or hierarchy. It's about shared identity. Humanity is presented as one expression, one unified reality that holds both masculine and feminine within it. And together, this unified humanity reflects the image of God. It's a different way to look at the starting point than what most people were taught. And if you pause long enough, you can feel how deeply that pattern echoes something inside of us. We begin our lives in a state of complete connection. As children, we're held within our family. We're shaped by community and sustained by something larger than ourselves. Identity at that stage isn't separate, it's shared. We belong before we ever define who we are. And as we grow, something begins to shift inside of us. There's a natural movement outward. We begin to differentiate, to form a sense of self, and to step beyond what we came from. Independence grows as identity becomes more personal, more defined, and more embodied. And there's even a biological pull to move beyond the immediate circle, to expand and to move beyond that same pattern we were born into. But that Movement outward is not the end of the story. Over time, something deeper begins to emerge. The need for connection returns, but in a new form, not as dependence, but as choice, not as something inherited, but something understood. And we begin to see that individuality without relationship becomes isolation. And isolation was never in the design. So the pattern unfolds. Unity into differentiation, into conscious reconnection. And that pattern is not just human development. It's written into the structure of the text itself. As that narrative moves into Genesis 2, the language begins to shift and the focus narrows. The human is described in a more personal and more localized way. And this is where the transition begins from Ha-Adam as a collective humanity into a more individualized human experience. This is not a contradiction. This is not two competing stories, it's progression. The text is moving from the broad into the specific, from the collective to the personal, and from shared identity into lived experience. The key word here is Ha-Adam. It doesn't mean Adam as a personal name. In Genesis 1, it means the human or humankind. The interpretation of it as a specific individual comes later. And when that later assumption is read back into the earlier passage, it quietly reshapes the meaning. This is one of the earliest moments where interpretation begins to bend the story in a direction that the original language doesn't require. And once that bend is in place, everything that follows begins to carry it forward. When this is understood in its proper context, the structure of the opening chapter becomes very clear in a way that feels almost undeniable. The story, the text, it's not repeating itself, and it isn't confused, and it isn't offering a conflicting account, as many believe. It's developing an idea with intention and with depth. First, humanity is introduced as a unified whole. And then that unified humanity is explored in a more personal and detailed way. And just like in human life, the movement doesn't stop at individuality. The deeper invitation is always towards reconnection. Not a loss of self, but a return to a relationship with a fully formed sense of self. The text reflects that same unfolding. It begins in unity. It moves through differentiation and opens the question of what it means to live in connection again without losing identity. What changes in the entire story if humanity begins as a unified whole instead of a single individual? And if the movement towards individuality isn't the end, but a part of a larger return to connection. It reshapes everything that follows. If the story begins with shared identity, then separation is something that develops later. It's not the foundation. It's not the starting point. And it removes the assumption that hierarchy is built into creation itself, and it replaces it with something far more connected, far more relational, and far more aligned with how life actually unfolds. Unity comes first. Individuality emerges, and connection is rediscovered with awareness. The original Trinity. that changes how you read everything that follows, not just in Genesis, but in the entire human story. The story does not begin with one person standing alone. It begins with humanity standing together. And if that's true, then maybe the journey was never about becoming separate. Maybe it has always been about remembering how to return, fully formed, back into connection. Take a moment and sit with that. Not as an idea, but as something personal. Where in your life have you mistaken separation for identity? Where have you been trying to stand alone when you were never meant to? And where might you already feel the quiet pull to reconnect? Not out of need, but out of understanding. Don't rush these questions. Let them sit with you today. Let them shape how you see the people around you. Let them soften the way you move through your own story. Because if unity was the beginning, then maybe it's also the direction. And maybe the next step isn't becoming something new. Maybe it's remembering what you were already a part of. One love, y'all.